Hi, I'm Colton. We're looking at an example of PolyJet post-processing. In this video, we're looking at the cup designed by Kinetic Vision. This cup is really meant to mimic the end product. There'll be some stages along the way of printing with lower post-processing or just print out glossy, and then you can still get some feedback there. But this post-processing procedure is for the cup that you're going to show the stakeholders, the decision makers. You're going to maybe show some customers to get feedback from. So it's going to the fullest extent. To post-process this cup, we started by sanding it with 120 grit sandpaper using a DA orbital air tool. And when we're sanding this, we want to pay particular attention to the side surfaces of PolyJet prints, because that's where we have the model support interface, where we have those layers that are going to be visible. So we need to sand those away. Now with this cup, we did model in a manual polishing layer, meaning that it's a body that makes the part a little thicker using clear material, or a layer of clear material where we're going to sand it the most. And that allows us to sand out those the model support interface layer without removing any of the color. After sanding with 120 grit, that's a step that takes the longest of the sandpaper. Then we get to move a bit faster through 220 grit and 400 grit sandpaper. We did 400 grit sandpaper dry, and then again 400 grit sandpaper wet. Wet sanding allows the particles that you're sanding off to be washed away so they don't make any imperfections in your part. And we did 400 again wet so we can check our work, because when the part is wet, we'll be able to see any scratches better. Then 600 wet and 800 wet sanding. After we're sanded to 800 grit, then we're going to let the part dry completely. After it's dry, then we used a degreaser. So we just took a lint-free cloth with degreaser and wiped it over the part to remove any dust and anything else that may have picked up in the lab space before clear coating. Always a good idea, not required, but it's a good idea before painting parts. After that's dry, we clear coated the part. Now on this part, we're only clear coating the sides and the bottom. The top, we're going to use a two-part super glaze or epoxy on. There's a separate video on that to check out. So we clear coated just one nice good layer or session of clear coat around the part, and we let that dry overnight. We don't want to touch it too soon and put any fingerprints on it. The next day, we went into wet sanding. Now you could just stop right here where the part is clear coated and say that suits our needs, done. Or you can take it a step further and remove the texture that is left behind by the clear coat. So for that, we wet sanded with 1000 grit, 1500, 2000, and 2500 grit sandpaper. And that sandpaper wet sanding is going to leave behind a bit of a fog, so that is removed with a buffing compound. Using, again, an air-powered tool, you can take the buffing compound and put it on your part, and really, again, they're good with each stage. If you have small parts or you just don't need an air-powered tool, you can also do this by hand using a lint-free cloth. Here I have a picture comparing two different parts that I post-processed with a similar process I just described, but with one of them, I went all the way through all these steps, and with the other one, the one on the right side of this picture, I only did 120 grit sandpaper and then clear coat, and then only 1000 grit wet sanding, and then buff.
I have an editor's note to add onto the end here. These two cups for the comparison picture were not actually printed the same way. The liquid color inside is slightly different, still experimenting at that point when this was printed with what color to use. But then also the orientation of the print was different. The one on the left was printed vertically. And that means on the bottom where it should be clear, we're actually looking at the edge of the print layers, which is not as transparent. Think of stacking a bunch of transparencies on top of each other and looking at the edge of that, or a bunch of CDs. And then the one on the right was printed laying down on the print tray. So looking at the front of the cup is actually the top of the print, and that gives transparent parts more clarity. So that looks better on the bottom of the part to print it laying down. The one on the right that was printed standing up, it looks better on the top of the cup where the liquid is, because it printed the top surface of the liquid more clear. So looking down on the liquid is more clear on the left one than it is on the right one. Depends what your priorities are.